Welcome to the On Becoming a Healer podcast. In each episode, we try to explore the issues and challenges that apply to becoming an effective healer. I'm Stefan Kierntes, here with my co-host, Saul Wiener. Hi, Saul.
Hi, Stefan.
In thinking about how we help people become healers, we need to address how we train, elevate, supervise, and nurture our future colleagues. And that's the topic of today's episode. We want to talk about the culture of medical training, aspects of it that we think are problems. A lot of these challenges are general. We're going to be talking for a moment about the Dartmouth Medical School. The story that we read in May in the New York Times described 17 students who were accused of cheating while taking examinations, which they were doing online. Their cases were developed based on the use of a learning management system called Canvas, which is able to track student activities during remote exams. The students, as reported by the Times on May 9th, had less than 48 hours to respond to emailed charges. They are not provided complete data logs for the exams, and they were advised to plead guilty, though they had denied cheating, or were given just 2 minutes to make their cases in online hearings. One of the elements that was striking about the story is that the students immediately began to discuss this issue on social media, which caused a social media policy to be issued by Dartmouth. According to the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, a report on April 14th, they note that a policy was made effective on April 5th, just days after the students began complaining online about having received these accusations. And they began to complain that they were worried that faulty evidence was being used against them and accusing them of academic misconduct. The June 10th Times reports that after the discussion of this in the public media, including the Times, the Geisel School of Medicine reversed course, and Dean Compton of the school is quoted as saying, "I have decided to dismiss all the honor code charges." This appears to be partly due to publicity in which it became clear that this online tracking system called Canvas actually could generate activity even when no one was interacting with it, and that some of the information that Dartmouth was using to identify students as cheating or checking other references probably was spurious or flawed electronic evidence. So why are we talking about this, Saul?
Well, first of all, in the interest of full disclosure, as you know, I attended Dartmouth Medical School. That was more than a quarter of a century ago. And while our episode today is really not so much about Dartmouth, but about what we can learn generally about education, I think it's just worth reflecting on the horribleness of what happened. So first of all, as you said, a bunch of students were accused of cheating. It was done based on data from Canvas, which is actually not designed for forensic purposes. So it's not a reliable system for detecting cheating. As you pointed out, the students were pretty much railroaded. They were told they had to respond in 48 hours, that they would only have 2 minutes to defend themselves before the committee if they chose to do so, that they were encouraged to just plead guilty, essentially, and that a number of students were then suspended, and apparently some were even expelled. And this is, again, all from the New York Times and other reliable news sources. And then we also know, as you said, that when they tried to communicate on social media about the situation and complain about the environment they were in, they were essentially silenced by the medical school, which rapidly issued a policy on social media that essentially said they were unprofessional if they were to talk this way publicly. So then, after all of this came out and saw the light of day, the dean, who initially was defensive about what had happened, had to backpedal and say that now they were dropping all charges. So presumably some students were unexpelled. I think it's hard to overstate the trauma students would have experienced as a result of going through this. There's a sense of trust in one's profession that would have been shattered. And I think some of the students interviewed in the New York Times actually said things along these lines. Now, when I read all of this, rather than seeing it as some sort of anomaly, it struck me as emblematic of a culture in medical education that is, to some extent, toxic and certainly dysfunctional. In my experience, policing of medical students can be quite extraordinary. For instance, I remember some years ago, one of my student advisees, I think he was a second-year medical student at the time, needed to take a few days off because his grandfather had died and he wanted to postpone an exam for a few days so that he could go to the funeral. And he was asked to get a death certificate to prove that his grandfather had in fact died. And some years later, when I was sharing this story with some other medical students, one of them replied, "Oh yeah, that's still true here." In fact, she had mentioned that one of her friends who's also a medical student. Well, his dad had had a heart attack and was in the coronary care unit. And again, this was a situation where the student was required to provide proof that this was in fact what was going on so that he could take some time off for about 3 days and again, postpone an exam briefly so that he would be able to be at his father's bedside. Now, neither of these two anecdotes occurred at Dartmouth. In fact, they occurred at two different medical schools. So I think there's some generalizability here. And the question I was asking myself is, wow, so we've admitted these students to a profession with the understanding that in a very short time, they're going to have extraordinary responsibility as physicians, surgeons, caring for people in life and death situations. And yet we don't believe that we can trust them when they tell us that they need a few days off so that they can go visit a critically ill family member or go to a funeral of a grandpa. I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, how does it feel to be treated that way? And what opportunities are we losing when we treat students this way in terms of creating a collegial environment where we can cultivate their professional identity? Now, I would raise the same concerns around the hypervigilance related to testing. And just to be clear here, I understand that cheating is common and cheating is a problem. But I think you have to step back and look at the curriculum more broadly. Why do we make medical students memorize mounds and mounds of stuff which they're going to forget, which I certainly don't recall, and I don't think most of my colleagues would recall, which is constantly getting updated, and which one can look up easily in the current information environment? Why are we creating conditions of extreme pressure and surveillance, almost as a kind of hazing of these students? I have to ask whether there's something else going on here, a kind of culture of infantilization that could be undermining the development of the personal and professional qualities that we need in our physicians.
Well, let me put on the hat, as it were, of a friendly medical school dean or administrator, and perhaps take a slightly opposed point of view. I could imagine an administrator, I know some who I really like, saying, look, what happened at Dartmouth is concerning. It seems like they were using incorrect forms of evidence to adjudicate cheating. But broadly speaking, when you run a medical school, we are expected to make sure that students learn certain content. And ultimately, that content is going to be various forms of national exams. We have to show that we are attempting to inculcate that content. We certainly have to monitor if it was learned. What else would you have me do, Saul, if I'm a well-intentioned administrator, even if I don't like exactly what went down at Dartmouth?
Stefan, I think you're accurately describing how people might respond to my critique, but it's worth considering that you can always come up with a justification for this kind of a status quo. You can say that you need multiple choice testing to show that students know what they need to know, even if they're going to forget it. You can say that you've got to prove that grandpa died before taking a test because, after all, there are always some bad actors who are going to try to take advantage of the system. You can always come up with answers to the concerns that I'm raising about what I see as a toxic culture of training that can be intensely controlling. But I think we need to step back and look at all of these facets in their totality and to say, is this really necessary? And also at what cost? For starters, I think we need to have a frank conversation collectively about whether we're actually happy with the doctors we in this country produce. And to do this honestly, we have to set aside our egos and our pride about what we want to believe about our profession. My research team has been analyzing over 1,000 audio recordings and medical records of physician-patient encounters a year. And what we found is it's beyond the scope of this podcast episode to discuss, but it matches many other studies. Physicians make so many mistakes all the time. They overuse medical services, they underuse medical services, they misuse medical services, they disregard patients' preferences, they ignore patient context, they fail to adapt known evidence-based practices for years, they document inaccurately. I mean, the list goes on and on. And the question is, does it really need to be this way, given that we're admitting the creme de la creme to medical school? I mean, what in heaven's name are we doing to them? Now, I want to qualify what I'm saying by acknowledging that we do have many very talented and capable physicians in this country. Problems I describe represent norms, averages. They're what we find in large studies. But given that they are so common and perhaps represent norms, I would then ask, are these exceptional physicians, are they products of our system, or did they come out that way despite it? And speaking of norms, I think we need to talk about the USMLE exams, which are supposed to be the ultimate gatekeeper of standards and norms, starting with that first exam that's given at the end of the second year. And while the USMLE portrays itself as essentially the gatekeeper and the standard bearer, I think we have to ask about the extent to which it also perpetuates some of the cultural problems that we've been talking about. Let me just give you one example. They have an average strict time limit on each question. I think it's 90 seconds. You read a case and you answer a question. And some students just can't read and process information that quickly. It may be that English is their second language. It may be that they're slow readers. They have a learning disability. And yet there's absolutely no evidence that the ability to answer one of these questions in 90 seconds instead of, say, 120 seconds separates future competent physicians from people who shouldn't be in medicine. And yet that's how it works. I mean, every year there are students who just can't show what they know under those particular testing conditions. And it can be extraordinarily painful. They may have to spend a year or years, or may not be successful at all in terms of advancing. And in my experience, the USMLE rarely grants accommodations when students request them, even after they've had documentation that they have some sort of learning need. And so, there's such a simple solution to this problem. Why not just give everyone extra time if they want it? That would eliminate any concerns about equity. Although, again, in my experience, most people who don't have learning issues or aren't slow readers just don't need the extra time, so they probably wouldn't want it anyway. But the point is, this is just an example of the kind of obstacles that are not grounded in evidence and that cause so much pain and confusion for so many students. So in sum, I think we need to reconsider this culture and what it's doing to future doctors in terms of creating insecurities, to some extent turning them into efficient task completers rather than healers, and fundamentally failing to prepare them in what appears to be so many ways.
So when we were talking about the Dartmouth example, obviously we have fair justification to be concerned that the accusations of cheating were incorrect. But I really want to emphasize this. I think what you're saying is that there's something about the very testing process itself that has you disturbed. And thus far, what I hear is you're not exactly saying all tests are wrong, but rather there's something wrong about how our standard medical school tests are constructed. Is that correct?
Yeah. And again, I think the testing is just a piece of a much larger puzzle. When I was a first-year medical student, there was this beloved older community physician who was on the faculty named John Radabow, and he would periodically come and sit in the first row of our lecture hall, and he would challenge faculty with questions like, tell me how what you just said is in any way relevant to what a doctor needs to know. So I don't think I'm ahead of my time, or that it's that unusual to think that a lot of what happens in medical school education, just doesn't make sense if the goal is to find the most efficient and effective way to make a great doctor. There seems to be much that's just superfluous and also so much that seems to be missing. So the question for me is, what's going on? I actually got great insight from this by rereading a philosopher that was assigned to us in college, Michel Foucault. He studied power and control. Power in organizations, he said, is highly diffuse, and it's basically a tool of social control. And he said there were three techniques of control: hierarchical observation, normalizing judgment, and what he called the examination. So before I kind of apply those, just consider that, when a med student starts at the beginning of medical school, the system basically seizes control of them quickly by swamping them with stuff to memorize, things to process and regurgitate. And of course, it's all justified as being necessary. However, as we saw at Dartmouth, students are also viewed with suspicion. They're hyper-monitored, and if there's evidence that they're deviating from norms, they get pounced on. And it can be really unforgiving. We saw at Dartmouth that accused students were told they had just 2 minutes to defend themselves and 48 hours to plead guilty. And as if all that's not stressful enough, at the same time, they're just racking up mounds and mounds of debt. So the stakes are getting higher and higher. The way students learn to succeed in this kind of environment is basically by falling into line. And that boils down to doing whatever's handed to them, to cramming for tests, by taking practice exams, by trying to shine on rounds, to impress the residents and the attendings, of course, without looking like that's what they're trying to do. And students get into serious hot water if they deviate. that can include questioning any of the authority figures, being an older student or PhD student, I think puts you at risk, or being a member of a marginalized group, such as a Black student who doesn't adhere to norms that are set by white culture. And as I describe in my book, On Becoming a Healer, you can even be criticized for seeming to caring about your patients. Residents can feel threatened, as if the student is showing them up. And I think that's because by the time they're residents, there's a lot of insecurity that's baked into them. And they're part of perpetuating. And that's, again, how power works. So in Foucault's framework, this basically makes sense. Hierarchy is here. It's medical students who are evaluated by the professors, and then by interns, and then by residents. And then, of course, they become attendings, and the system goes on. And the process is really focusing on, again, what Foucault called normalizing judgment, the emphasis on maintaining standards and a sanction for not reaching those standards. It's all monitored through observance. There's the imposition of precise and detailed norms, and there's punishment for deviance. And then finally, what Foucault called the examination, which again comes close to what happened at Dartmouth, and I think is the culture at many places. There's this justification that there's this truth, and we're testing you to see if people can achieve that truth, when in fact, it's more than just testing for competence. I think there's a component of exercising control. I think it's important to recognize that Foucault didn't really have a negative view of power per se. He was just trying to describe how it works diffusely within organizations and society. And the point is that there's, at least in my view, something meta going on here that we need to interrogate. We have to ask ourselves, what is being perpetuated here? And is it producing the kind of physicians that society needs?
So because you sound like you don't like this system, I feel driven to articulate why a member of the American public might like it. So imagine that I know a loved one of mine is going to be appearing at some hospital anywhere between the West Coast to the East Coast and maybe Hawaii with pneumonia. I want some assurance that basically the treatment they're going to get in any one of those places is not radically different from one place to the other. I want to know that more or less there's standard antibiotics, that there's standard protocols for when to institute respiratory support, etc. Isn't it a system of control that's necessary in order to provide me that assurance that my mother's going to get the same care in Hawaii as in South Carolina?
Well, first of all, the American public should know, as I know you are aware, that that's already not happening. We have massive amounts of research going back decades to show there's wide geographic variations in care. And ironically, that work was pioneered at Dartmouth, starting with Jack Wenberg's seminal studies starting in the 1970s. So if that's what the public wants, the status quo in medical education is definitely not working for them. Now, of course, the reason for that variation is multifactorial. It's not just medical education. That said, I do agree there's a certain standardization in medical education, which creates a consistency. But the question is, what's the quality of the product? Medical students all over the country can be memorizing, regurgitating, and then forgetting a lot of the same extraneous information with a lot of the same gaps in fundamental thinking and reasoning skills and a fragile sense of well-being, but that's not necessarily reassuring. Physicians may also be similarly socialized. For instance, I've noticed that doctors are quick to criticize the healthcare system in which they work, complaining about electronic medical records, insurance companies, corporate medicine, and that's totally justified. But how many point the finger at how they themselves have been trained and what kind of professional it's turned them into? It's extremely hard to essentially negatively critique yourself. So I don't think there is reason to be assured that physicians who come through our system will have the qualities you describe. And of course, some do. But is that because of the system or despite it?
Well, then that leads to the counter question, which is, do we know of a different way, of a better way, potentially, to inculcate good medical practice?
Well, there's a growing body of knowledge about how to educate adults. It involves challenging them with problems to solve that are relevant to the professions they're entering into, to what they're going to do, creating safe spaces where they can be open about what they do and don't understand, encouraging their curiosity, supporting everyone to arrive at their own pace and mastery of the skills they need, rather than what everyone can do on, say, June 27th from 3 to 4:30 p.m. on a multiple choice test. And again, goal here is getting everyone to mastery. We need assurance that they've developed the qualities and the skills we believe they need. Now, in all fairness, medical schools around the country have been introducing changes to their curricula. There's been less lecture, more group problem solving, a shift to pass-fail grading, and I think that's great. But on the other hand, it doesn't assure that the culture is healthy and that the faculty support and reinforce a healthy culture. I actually think the brand new medical schools have the best chance to get it right because they're starting with a clean slate rather than just being locked into old ways. But whether they actually do respect and support students, especially those who are not cut out for the conventional way students are tested, well, that depends on the leadership.
Two words came out there that are very interesting to me. One is assurances and the other is adults. So let's talk about assurances. Is there another way to get assurance that the person in front of me is on the right path to becoming a doctor besides throwing a test at them? What would it be? Would it be observation? Would it be having them write an essay? What would it be to assure me that they're on the right path?
Well, I don't mean to be snarky, but I think it's important to start by pointing out that we certainly don't seem to be doing that now. Countless studies show that, as I mentioned earlier, physicians screw up in so many ways all the time. My own research focuses on whether physicians are paying attention to the life challenges of their patients when they plan their care. And the evidence is that most fall short of appropriate care a good deal of the time. And quite frankly, none of this should be surprising if you look at how physicians are actually trained and acculturated. So while I agree that we need to have rigorous measures of competence, I'd like to make the perhaps provocative argument that the whole quote-unquote we must assure standards thing is a bit of a decoy from the unpleasant reality that we are training medical students to pass tests that are measuring things that may not be particularly meaningful, and that a great deal of what does matter is neither being taught nor tested. So to answer your question, in all honesty, I think it's very difficult to truly assess all of the qualities required to be a highly competent medical school graduate or residency-trained physician. We're clearly failing now. On the other hand, I think it wouldn't matter that much if we really thought about what makes a great physician and then essentially reverse engineered medical education based on that understanding. Now, many medical educators would say that this is already happening, but I question whether what's going on is really transformative enough. I think medical educators would have to look candidly at the many ways in which we're failing at the level of the curriculum and culture to bring about real change. One thing that really surprised me when I first saw it were the number of studies comparing physicians to non-physicians in terms of quality of care and patient outcomes, ranging from nurse practitioners in primary care to nurse anesthetists, showing no differences or minimal differences or debate about whether there are differences. Quite frankly, given the incredible cost, effort, and time that goes into physician training, there should be a chasm of difference. To me, that suggests we're not spending the time very well. Medical students are such a bright and motivated and impressionable group of talented young adults when they arrive. There's a good chance that if we did right by them, assessment would hardly matter. I mean, they'd be so far ahead of where they are now. And, of course, we'd find some imperfect way to assess them.
The other word that I mentioned that caught my ear, at least, is adults. And I think that the Dartmouth story to me is most striking because the presumption is that the students are, if they're adults, they're criminals. But if they're not adults, they're children who essentially grasp at whatever is the easy thing rather than doing the right thing. And I have to admit, I share this concern that oftentimes the individuals who come to us as medical students, particularly on the hospital wards, have plenty of life experience, lots of insight, and we don't respond to them like that. We don't respond to them as adults like us. We respond to them as these sort of novel creatures who've just emerged from the womb, which is usually untrue. But I've been sort of troubled by it, both when we are unfriendly to them, but also sometimes in the way that we're friendly to them. We sort of say, now, what a cute thing that the medical students know what to do. How cute that they figured it out. And I see this on social media sometimes as well. And I find it kind of odd because these are, in fact, fully grown people.
Yes, I think we do need to think about why this kind of infantilization happens and what it does to people. Again, I find Michel Foucault's work helpful here. When you treat adults like children, you're taking their individuality away. It's a way of seizing power and control. Now, while I do see a rationale for doing this in military training, I think it's counterproductive in medical education. I think that many medical students find it jarring, and certainly those who are not right out of college. A number of students, by the time they get to medical school, have had professional lives, sometimes even as teachers themselves. I think for some students, it's just corrosive to their sense of self-worth. Your value becomes concentrated around, what the medical school wants to measure, like, how you do on our multiple choice tests, and then later how you fit in with the culture of the medical teams you're on. I also think we need to consider how this patronizing culture towards students influences the doctors they become. On the one hand, you've been rewarded for years of fitting in with the prevailing culture of medicine, and then for becoming an efficient task completer. And you know how to get through a medical visit in a professional way. But the question in my mind is, are you going to be comfortable fully engaging with patients, not just in the guise of some sort of persona, but as yourself, truly present? And can you shift out of that efficient task completer mode and really figure out what your patients need? As you know, my research team listens to thousands of recordings of physician-patient encounters, and what we hear is often quite sad. It's just a limited bandwidth. You can hear a physician clicking on a keyboard, either efficiently going through a set of questions, and there's just a sense of lack of human connection. I'm not saying it's always like this, but in my experience, it is rare that a physician doesn't pull back when a patient is expressing grief or pain.
So is there some resemblance, perhaps, as you're talking about these physician-patient encounters? I'm beginning to see a parallel here, and I think you're trying to lay it out, that there is a parallel between the medical teacher-medical student encounter and the physician-patient encounter. In each case, the recipient of that encounter, it's sort of situated a little bit one way, which is I elicit things from you, and I assess if you have produced what I need in order to fit you into a category. That can be the dialogue for me to diagnose and treat, or it can be the dialogue, the sort of litmus test for me to assess if you're a good student. Is there that parallel there going on?
Yes, we do model our behavior based on what we observe and how we're treated ourselves. During medical training, certain kinds of personal growth are rewarded, and other kinds are not. If you're efficient, smart, fun, no matter what you're feeling inside, you'll be admired and you'll be liked. And on the other hand, if you show vulnerability or you stumble, you can get battered. Now, at the same time, what patients need from their doctor is someone who's curious and who's eager to know them. And I think that if the doctor has not been accorded that respect in their own training, they're less likely to show it to others. Actually, they're less likely to know how to show it to others. The message at Dartmouth, when the students were told you have just 2 minutes to defend yourself, is that who you are doesn't matter to us if we don't think you're playing by our rules. And while that situation may seem extreme, it also strikes me as emblematic of a larger culture.
Yeah, it's normal. I mean, one could argue that we've set up a system in which we are all experts at knuckling under. And that might be, at one level, better than a system in which everybody is a rebel. I say that's my bias. But I'm reflecting on this, that as a student, I was highly attuned to figuring out what were the standardized expectations of me, and often delivering precisely what I thought was wanted. Occasionally I failed to do that, and it bit me in the butt, so to speak. But more often than not, I really did. But I think I share with you the concern that there is a lot of humanity that actually could be of service to healing relationships that we kind of extract or cause people to leave by the wayside as they fall into that mode. The problem is measuring that. I think it's really hard to show precisely when that humanity has been dropped and lost. And it's sometimes hard to show when, how could you reassemble it? Let's say we all agreed right now we want to change something. Is it a broad discussion that involves licensing boards and the testing organizations and the medical deans that needs to engage this, or is it some other set of citizens who need to look at this?
That's a great question. The leaders and organizations you mentioned stand too much to gain by maintaining the status quo. Remember, medical education is a system that involves a lot of money, power, and status, and the folks you mentioned are benefiting greatly from it. Medical education has a halo around it. And there are TV shows that romanticize the training of doctors, and at ritualized events, whether it's the white coat ceremony or medical school graduation, those leaders, medical school deans, department heads, they all show up in their robes and talk about the nobleness of the profession. And I think those who are going through the process mostly buy into it. The system, after all, virtually guarantees those who can adapt to it near certain employment and very high paying jobs. So I think change will have to come from the outside. It will require some sort of myth busting. The profession needs to be exposed for its shortcomings by those who are not invested in preserving the mythology and who can see past it. One thing I can imagine changing it is, believe it or not, automation. A lot of what the profession puts on a pedestal, things like being a walking encyclopedia, making difficult diagnoses, and doing procedures, these are things computers and robots will probably do far better. What robots can't do is be human. Engage with a sense of shared humanity with patients, which requires personal growth and the curiosity to get to know people who are vulnerable and who are seeking your help. Unfortunately, these are the very qualities that the current medical education system pays lip service to, but actually sometimes even tramples. Now, that said, on a personal scale, those of us who mentor and teach students, we can try to break from the mold and give our students a safe space to learn and grow.
Yeah, I think about this obviously from my own position as a faculty member, albeit not an administrator, which is there's a person in front of me. They are likely to make a difference in other lives. How do I help you take advantage of your skills and proclivities to make the best possible contribution, rather than how do I sculpt you into what I was told I need to sculpt you into?
Yes, and I think this need to sculpt students, as you put it, is particularly damaging when the student is somehow different, an outlier of sorts. These are often students who we think of as being from marginalized groups, Black, low income, Hispanic, maybe having some kind of learning difference. These students often have a lot to offer. And in fact, they're recruited to medical schools specifically to bring diversity. And yet once they arrive, they're expected to conform to a culture that does not recognize their value. And by the way, sometimes I've even seen students with PhDs get hammered, especially when their curiosity and questioning disrupts the hierarchy.
Yeah, people who don't fit in they cannot fit the template either because of ethnic background, maybe not being extroverts. Being extrovert is often very helpful. It can be cognitive style. It can be the way they speak, any number of things like that. I think I agree with you there that it's better to be asking, what is this person on the verge of contributing, rather than why are they not fitting my template?
Yeah, one thing I think would be interesting, and I'm going to turn the tables here, is to talk about your own experience. Because you fit the prototype of the privileged, white, very smart kid with no learning disability who had all the acumen necessary to fit the mold, to just shine in medical school, to be a great student. And all that turned out to be true. You were a great student and you did sail. So I'd like to get your thoughts on what the process was like for you and the way it shaped how you've looked for affirmation and meaning throughout your training and your career.
I think the first thing to acknowledge is that, and I'm going to, obviously there are certain problems I had to overcome, but the truth is there's much as you say, I was adept verbally and I was excellent at standardized exams. Where other people might fall short, I could usually intuit what was the likely intent behind a poorly written question to give the answer that I thought would work for the poorly written question. My verbal skills were relatively polished by the time I was a medical student, and I could deliver presentations relatively quickly and often get credit for those. In fact, I remember memorizing and rehearsing and presenting adeptly, partly because I had been just trained to a very high verbal shine, and I was a little bit of a ham, an extrovert who could enjoy it. So those things all really stood me in good stead. I think going further later in my career, there were a number of places where I was able to fulfill expectations because I could sense what they would be. The challenges were twofold. One was, of course, I wasn't free of my own legitimate quirks and challenges that I had to overcome. So one of which was sort of extraneous attention to detail. The other one was trying to figure out, well, what of all of this is truly meaningful to me? And how will I interact with people who are disappointing my expectations? So somewhere in medical school, I realized that I was very efficient at doing the things in front of me, and that I was at a loss for what would be a meaningful way to carry forward a life. And yet I had some sort of thirst that something needed to be defined in terms of a personal mission statement other than moving up an escalator. That would not be sufficient. And I think that was where the challenge was, because there was no specific tool in medical school that was designed to help you figure out what your future meaning would be in practicing medicine.
Yeah, I mean, knowing you for many, many years, I think you turned out great. But I think it's because of qualities you had and that preceded your going to medical school. Things like your curiosity, your visceral response when you see people being harmed, your desire to step in and do something about it. All qualities that took you past just wanting to do great on multiple choice tests. But at the same time, what I'd like to ask is, to what extent did you develop a kind of Pavlovian response to being rewarded for being the good student and shining and getting that A? To what extent has that shaped you throughout your career?
Well, I was certainly hooked on it at the beginning. And to some degree, I still am. That is, until, relatively recently in my career, and I'm now in my 50s, each grade, grant review, paper review had come through as a kind of evaluation of whether I'm good enough. And yet I have to say, all along, I was kind of keenly aware that there were people next to me who basically were interchangeable with me, but just didn't deliver with the right polish and were getting penalized for that. And I fully understood that the polish I was adding was not substantial or not necessarily material to whether the kind of medicine you practice is right. So I think I was also kind of aware that on the one hand, I was a bit hooked on reward. And on the other hand, there were people who couldn't secure those rewards who were perfectly viable, exciting people who you'd want to have as colleagues. So I think I had a little bit of a sense that this was a good situation for me, but maybe a bit distracting to my ego and potentially punitive for people who are not like me, which bothered me.
I think you bring up two important points here. One is that even if you're successful and thrive in the system, it can still do some harm by getting you hooked on looking good and performing well as defined by standards that may not actually prioritize what's best for the patient in front of you. And second, that the system gives lower marks to others who may also be great doctors, but just not as good at meeting expectations.
Yeah, the word that you came up was performance. And usually the word performance is applied when we're talking about scoring and grading. And the behaviors that we cultivate in a culture of performance are often performative behaviors. That is to show you that I could rather than to actually do the right thing. But in that regard, then the bureaucracies, which we help staff, it is our own people go forward to become the medical directors and even the chief executives of insurance companies and federal bureaucracies. It's our people who are actually insisting on that same cultural performance in the system that we allow to run us.
Yeah, and I think by the time physicians are embedded in this medical industrial complex, they've learned how to perform, how to play the game, so to speak. It reminds me of a study I published, and it was by no means the first of its kind, in which we compared what was on audio recordings that we'd made of physician-patient encounters to what they'd put in their notes. And physicians were unaware of when they were being recorded, and that was a part of the protocol. We found an enormous amount of falsification across a wide range of notes. Physicians often documented things that had not occurred during the visit, but were necessary to put there in order to bill at a particular level. Now, when we published these findings, you'd have thought there would be a great reaction of shock and horror. How can it be that physicians are falsifying stuff in the medical record? But basically, it just got a big old yawn. Now, at the same time, when a bunch of first-year medical school students might be, possibly cheating on some multiple choice questions, the hammer comes down. And then it turns out that may not have been accurate in the first place. So you have to ask yourself, what's wrong with this picture that we are so intent on policing students on multiple choice tests at the beginning of their career? And yet when we see real physicians making up stuff in patients' actual medical record, everyone just shrugs. I mean, to be honest, I don't have an answer to that, but I think it's interesting.
Right. In a situation, I mean, by the way, just to note what those Dartmouth students were accused of, they were given the rules of their test. Presumably they weren't supposed to look up a resource, but to look up a resource to get the right answer might in fact be a very good thing to do in general, even if it maybe wasn't within the confines of the rules of their particular exam. But what you're describing is a study in which, in fact, physicians were documenting activities they had not done or failing to document things that they actually did do in the course of an exam. There's no situation under which that is correct. And yet no one's alarmed by that.
Exactly. And I want to go back to a point you just made, which is that the conditions of the exam that the Dartmouth students were taking were set so that they were told they couldn't look at resources. And if they did, that would be considered cheating. And I think the point you made is that in real practice, you probably wouldn't want your doctor relying on their memory when they're unsure of important decisions. You'd probably want them to be looking stuff up. So you have to question the foundations of these very conditions that were set. Why were they creating a test where you couldn't do something that you probably should be doing in real practice? And you have to ask yourself whether there is some unspoken motive here. One that comes to mind is that it's just harder to create exams where you're testing what people can do when they have the full suite of resources available to them compared to what they can just memorize and regurgitate. And the heavy-handedness with which the students were treated also makes me think of Michel Foucault's theory of discipline and control.
So as we look forward, those of us who are in practice now, or those of us who are going to interact with students tomorrow, how should we frame it in our own minds? How can we be best for them and best in the process of making our profession a better one?
Well, I think we need to start by acknowledging that there is some change happening in medical education. I mentioned earlier that there's less emphasis on grades, there's more flexibility. Some schools are giving students more time to get through their training if they have family and so forth. But in my opinion, the revolution has not yet happened. There needs to be a real consideration of the culture of training, and that has to begin by acknowledging that many of the doctors we're producing are not a particularly happy group, that they're often not functioning with full integrity, that they are often lacking qualities that patients need and want. I think that conversation is difficult to have. As I said, most major change has come from outside the profession. For instance, when limits were finally set on work duty hours for residents about 20 years ago, it wasn't from within the profession. It was pressure from outside the profession, including from Congress. So I think one has to be skeptical that the profession can transform itself. But the profession is a product of the larger society, and society is taking a hard look at itself. When we look at the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter or the acceptance of people who are transgender, we're seeing major changes in society, which will hopefully filter through our own profession and begin to change our culture. It may surprise people, but the medical profession is generally a follower, not a leader of social progress. Revolutions tend to happen outside and then filter in rather than inside and filter out. But wouldn't it be wonderful if our profession, after all, it proposes to be a profession about healing, were to begin to lead and to fundamentally rethink what it means to nurture a great physician and how best to get talented and multifaceted young people to get them there.
Amen. I think with that, I'll just say thank you very much. I really appreciated this conversation, and I think we'll be curious to see what other people's reactions are as well.
Well, thanks, Stefan.
Thank you, Saul.
We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have, and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now.